get into it. And if somebody else jumps in, then that's great. But it'll be a small group, and this will be more discussion oriented than the things that we've been doing on the other nights where it was more of a presentation. So basically more of a small group class format. And I'm kind of looking forward to that. So why don't we just open with a prayer and we'll dive right in. So pray with me in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it has been a couple of months since we were working through this together. And so we've just tried to get back into it. As I said, what I'd like this to be is more of a small group discussion tonight than the kind of presentations we've been doing on Facebook or Zoom the last couple of last 6-8 weeks. And so I'd like to just encourage us to have that conversation here and talk about what we want to talk about. But before I go any further, does everyone still have their workbook from when we were together as a class? Because that's kind of the outline.
Yes.
I can do some screen sharing of it, but if you don't have it, I can email it to you as a PDF.
We have it, just not right in front of us right now.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just kind of be talking through it, but that's what I'll be following. I'll be following the outline of that handout, that book. So just kind of resuming the lessons, and so just to kind of go from where we were, we had gotten through the first half of the book of Acts when we stopped. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about the second half of the book of Acts and Paul's letters. So basically tonight is about Paul, his missionary journeys and whatnot in the book of Acts and his letters. And that's going to be our focus tonight. And then we're going to finish next week by talking about the letters of the other apostles and the other apostolic letters and Revelation. So, but before I even dive into that, I would just open it up to, since we've not been together for a while, to conversation or questions on your part about anything, about the New Testament up until this point, just to get us all back in sync that you're wondering about, or maybe questions that you have, just so we kind of all get back on the same page. And maybe there's some things that have come up over the last couple of months that you're interested in. So does anybody have anything that they would like to ask or to have me address, or questions about the New Testament up till this point?
No, we're good.
Okay.
No.
Great. Okay, well, let's start with, let's get into, like I said, we were about halfway through the book of Acts. And if you don't have that handbook in front of you, or if you don't recall, because it was 2 months ago, let me kind of refresh our memory about the book of Acts and what we were talking about at that time. And what I was saying at that time was that there's 2 ways to look at how the book of Acts is organized. And the first way is what we call a concentric method that follows the missionary expansion of the church. So if you recall, in the Great Commission, Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea," right? Throughout Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so there's this notion of this concentric expanding circle of the kingdom of God, of the church. And that's what begins to happen, right? So on Pentecost, there are witnesses in Jerusalem. And in the first couple of chapters of Acts, take place in Jerusalem and right around Jerusalem, in Judea. And then you see at a certain point, a few chapters into Acts, the apostles expand their activity kind of throughout the rest of Israel. And then, of course, it takes off. And at a certain point, Paul, the apostles and others, mostly Paul, begin to expand throughout, the rest of the world. And so it's that sense of way to read Acts as the fulfillment of the Great Commission. If you recall that, if that makes sense. But I also said there was another way to look at it, and that way, what I just described is a perfectly legitimate way to read the book. But it's the favored Protestant view of the way to read the book. That doesn't make it illegitimate. I mean, but Protestants favor that sort of lens, that way to understand the book of Acts, because it's about expanding mission. But there's another way to sort of understand how Acts is organized. And that's what we were talking about right before the COVID shutdown. And that was that the first half of the book of Acts focuses on the leadership of Peter. It's a story of Peter's leadership. And then at a certain point, about halfway through the book of Acts, the focus of the book shifts to Paul. And so what you're seeing is the book of Acts is the story of Peter's leadership of the church. And then the second half of the book being Paul's missionary activity. And not to oppose those two, but to see them as sort of a conjunction. And if you've got the, like I said, if you've got the book, that's what we were talking about in the fourth lesson. And it sort of like follows those two halves. In fact, let me see if I can throw this up on the screen share for you to make that make sense, because it's, I think, pretty material. So here, let me share a chart with you. Share screen. You should see a screen share up there now.
Yep.
And I'm going to go back here. This is this was from the lesson that we were doing right before the shutdown. And that you see this kind of understanding of how it begins the book of Acts with apostolic succession. The apostle Judas is replaced by Matthias. And then you have Peter preaching the first sermon, Peter baptizing the first converts, Peter doing the first miracle in Jesus' name. And more large that so it's easier for you to read. Oh, arg. You see Peter doing all of these things. He's calling for repentance in the temple. His shadow is healing people. He's establishing the first deacons. He kind of repeating Christ's miracles. And then around chapter 9, Paul gets converted. And after Paul gets converted, the focus of the book of Acts shifts. This another way to look at it is Peter kind of drops out of the picture. And the last time that Peter actually occurs in the book of Acts, and it's actually the last time he sort of narratively occurs in the New Testament, is at the Council of Jerusalem, chapter 15, where all the apostles come together and decide that the Gentile converts don't need to adopt the Jewish ceremonial laws. And Peter pronounces that. And then after that, the story is all about Paul taking that news outward on his missionary journeys. Now, I like this way of looking at it. Like I said, I think both ways to look at the book of Acts are totally valid. Like I said, Protestants don't like this one because they're not excited about emphasizing the primacy of Peter. But I like to think of it this way because, of course, as a Catholic, I like to think of this sort of organizational scheme. I think it's actually kind of helpful, and it's a good way to think about how the apostles work together, and it keeps us from something I'll talk about a little bit later, which is this notion that we sort of pit Peter and Paul against each other as being sort of, and I think sometimes the Protestant perspective does that because they were really working in tandem. One other reason why I had said the last time we were together that I think that this makes sense is you got to remember when Paul is traveling around in his missionary journeys, the author, the person who wrote the book of Acts is St. Luke, if you recall. Luke was he was a physician. He was a Jew, but he was a Greek-speaking. He came from, and I'll show you a little bit, this sort of Greek-speaking world or Roman world. And he becomes Paul's traveling companion. And he writes not only the Gospel of Luke, but he writes Acts. And it's mentioned several times that he is accompanying Paul on his missionary journeys. So if you think about this book being written, at a certain point, Paul starts going out and traveling around the Roman world, and Luke is with him. and Luke is recording what Luke is seeing. So Peter dropping out does not mean that Peter has ceased to be important, I think, as the Protestants would say. As the Protestants say, Peter now is not important, and the emphasis is on Paul. I think it's more that Luke is recording the activity of Paul because he's traveling with him and recording the activity of Paul, and what Paul is doing. Peter is continuing to do things. In fact, we know at one point Peter goes to Rome, but Peter going to Rome is never actually recorded in the New Testament. So we know that from extra biblical history, but there's nowhere in the New Testament that describes Peter's time in Rome, because he goes there, and again, Luke is writing this story. So it's just a way to sort of frame some perspective, and that's kind of bringing us up to where right after that that was the end of our last lesson. Let me pause there, and let me unshare this screen. Or well, actually, I think I'll stay on screen share for just a second. But any questions about that, or does that make sense to anybody? Okay. Again, call out if you've got any questions. So that brings us to tonight. This is now the beginning of the lesson that we would have been covering if we hadn't been shut down. And that is that at this certain point right after chapter 9 chapter 15 in Acts, now it shifts to Paul. And again, the Protestant perspective, and I want to stress this because trying to understand our Catholic faith and how to read this, is that the Protestant perspective is that what happens when after chapter 15 in Acts, as we get into the missionary journeys of Paul, that now this is really the early years of the church, and Protestants are focused on the churches that Paul is starting as basically models for what the church should look like going forward. And their objection to the Roman Catholicism is that when we read in the second half of the book of Acts about Paul starting all of these churches, there's no description of hierarchy. There's no description of bishops. There's no description of popes. There's no description of this. They're loosely organized house churches. And the Protestant perspective of the reformers was, well, look, all we have to do is go to the book of Acts and see how Paul was establishing the church. And that's the model going forward. But then somehow along the way, all of this other stuff, all of this hierarchy and rules and order and Rome and everything else got layered on top of that sort of pure infancy, that sort of pure youthful energy of the early church when it was just meeting in homes. And that's what the church should always have been. And like I said, their argument for that is to go back and read the second half of the book of Acts and read how Paul was setting those churches up. So how do we respond to that as Catholics? And I think I've still got the screen share up here. Let me just kind of share kind of some quick points about that. One of the things is I think that we have to be careful about ascribing a correlation between the amount of words the Bible spends on a topic and how important that topic is, right? I mean, we could go into the Old Testament and say, hey, there's sections in the Old Testament that spend an enormous amount of time describing in enormous detail the various genealogies or describing, you could make the argument that the Bible spends more time telling the story of the book of Tobit than describing the crucifixion and the resurrection. But nobody, would rationally say that because you have fewer words spent on the crucifixion and the resurrection, then that's less important than the book of Tobit. And so I think that there's this argument that I think a lot of Protestants will use that look at how much time is spent in the Bible describing the early missionary churches of Paul. And so that therefore must be the model for the church for all time. And you go, well, I'm not sure that just because there's a lot of time spent on that, that should be the template. The other thing is that, as I said, number 2 here, is that, remember, the book of Acts was written less than 10 or 20 years after those missionary journeys. I mean, if Paul's journeying around in the 40s and the 50s, and the book of Acts and these letters are being written in the 60s, so you're talking about something that only happened, 10, 12, 15 years before. Be like us talking about something that happened in 2008. And it's still fresh in everybody's minds, and it's current events. So there's a lot of things being described in the book of Acts that are essentially almost current events for the readers. And so there's reasons why those are described in enormous detail, because you're writing to people who lived through those events, and you're saying, well, Paul went to Philippi and he met with Lydia and he talked to so-and-so. And then because Paul, in one of his letters to the Philippians, describes Lydia and so-and-so and so-and-so, and he describes these people. And now you're writing to these people or to people who know these people. So again, I'm trying to back off and say that what we read in the book of Acts isn't necessarily a template for the church for the next 2,000 years. We have to read it in that context. The other thing is that it was really important to describe all of these things in Acts because they established the legitimacy of these new churches. So when you look at all of these new churches that Paul's traveling around and setting up, the question is, are they legitimately the church? Because we know that there were false apostles traveling around setting up heretical churches. So if you have these false apostles setting up heretical churches, the question is, which are the legitimate ones? So one of the reasons why Luke spends so much time recording that Paul went to such and such a city and talked to so-and-so and this person were involved in establishing a church is it establishes the legitimacy of those early churches in the first generation, that they were established by Paul. And it also, I would say that it was demonstrating in almost real time the power of Christ over all the competing powers in their civilization. So if you think back, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later, but you think about all the things that Paul was challenging. Paul goes to Athens and he challenges the philosophers and the academics of his day. It was almost like going to Harvard or going to Oxford and arguing with the great intellectuals of the day. And then he goes to Corinth and he's arguing with all these leaders in the markets of Corinth. It'd be like traveling to New York or Los Angeles and talking to Silicon Valley and talking to the tech people and these gurus. And then he's over here doing this and he's over here doing that. And he goes to Rome and he's challenging, the power of Rome, and he's fighting in the courts. And so again, you're writing these letters to people who are living or, just 10 or 15 years after that happened. And you're describing how the church, we read it as something read it as literally ancient history, but to them it wasn't ancient history. It was written 10 years after it was happening. And so they're hearing about how Paul is doing this and he's doing that, or he recently did that, or 15 years ago he did that. And it's establishing that the church is taking over and penetrating and conquering all these aspects of their society. And I think the final thing I would say is that the story of his missionary journeys is, I think, a model for how evangelization happens. And that's where I think, my Protestant days, one of my takeaways from that I think is right, is that because I don't pit Peter against Paul, I see them both as essential key apostles with different roles. Peter has a governance role in the church, and Paul is the missionary leader. And he's showing us how mission happens, how evangelization happens. He travels the world. He does certain kinds of things in certain ways. He establishes new churches. He converts believers. He disciples them. And so in the first half of the book of Acts, you're seeing how Peter is establishing the governance of the church. And I think that that's showing us that there is a template for the church, as Catholics, that Peter is establishing hierarchy and governance. And then again, the conversation or the focus shifts to here's how Peter established governance, and now here's how Paul is establishing mission and evangelization. So those two things become complementary. So I'm gonna stop there and pause for questions. Again, I didn't want this to be so much of a lecture as questions, comments, thoughts about the things I've just been sharing. How many of you have had experience with, Protestants where, there's this very different kind of understanding of what the church is, than Catholics, not just the sacramental part, but, for Protestants, especially evangelicals, the notion of the house church is so appealing, right? Because they read how, and you hear this over and over and over again. I heard it. I used to teach that the early church was made up of house churches, just groups of believers gathering together in homes. And that's what Paul was establishing around the world. And that somehow that all got wrong. And we started building these big churches and these big basilicas and having all this hierarchy and order when it needs to go back to that early energy of just believers meeting together in homes. That was what the model of the church that Paul set up. How many of you ever kind of encountered that viewpoint?
Yes.
Because you'll hear that a lot from ex-Catholics. So one of the things I'm not necessarily proud about, it's just the way, my journey turned out, is that when I was a Protestant missionary and pastor, I baptized hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of converts. But I would say a very large number, over time, I baptized a very large number of Catholics, cradle Catholics who left the Catholic Church. And, of course, when I was, 20 years ago, I didn't know better, but they would come to, the ministries I was associated with, and it was always a familiar pattern. So they would come to not only the Sunday teaching, but they would come to Bible studies, or they would come to these midweek teachings, and they would start hearing all the things that we've been talking about, or teaching the Bible to them. And there's this energy and focus. People are reading their Bibles or bringing their Bible to church. All of a sudden they're discovering the Word. And I saw this happen hundreds of times in my life. And so it's almost a pattern. And then somebody like that would come up. They would want to talk after a church meeting or after a service or something, and after a Bible study or whatnot. And they would come up and they would say, hey, I've been coming for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I'm so excited. And, I grew up Catholic, but in the Catholic Church, we never read the Bible. I never heard any of this stuff. We didn't pay attention to the Bible, anything about it. And now all the Word of God is being opened to me. And I just see all these people staying around, immersing themselves in the Word of God. And I'm really learning about Jesus. In fact, one of the things I heard over and over and over again, and I'm not going to defend this, but I'm just saying I can testify, I heard it hundreds of times, is what would come out of their mouths is, I wasn't raised Christian, I was raised Catholic. I heard that hundreds of times. I'm so excited now, to discover a Christian church, because I was raised Catholic, and it's the first time I've ever been to a Christian church, and I'm really loving it. And they would say, all of that hierarchy and all, they wouldn't use the word hierarchy, but all this stuff, the Catholic Church, and it's just all the rules, and it's all this, and it's all the, blah, 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 and the big wigs and everything else. And now we're just sitting around together as brothers and sisters. We're opening the Word of God, and we're praying, and we're hearing about Jesus and God's Word all the time. We never heard that in the Catholic Church. And then they would say, well, I want to get baptized because I've never known, Jesus like this before. I've never known his Word and all that. And so there was this energy that would come because they felt like, and they would say, now I finally am discovering what Christianity was supposed to be like, is believers just coming together, and these house churches, and that was what Paul tried to set up. And somehow the Catholic Church messed that all up for thousands of years. And then they would all want to get rebaptized or get baptized because they said, well, I was kind of baptized in the Catholic Church, but now I really believe in Jesus and discovered his Word. And so for me, this is a real live thing, because I think that the church the Catholic Church, not only just in America, but around the world, has been hemorrhaging out people to evangelical churches for the last 50, 60 years. And I can say that from my personal experience because I was on the receiving end of catching them. And where it really is going on is in South America. So I've been to Central America, South America, those places a lot of times, and worked with big churches down there. And one of the big problems the Catholic Church has in Latin America is a lot of nominal Catholics, people who are born Catholic, credo Catholics or whatever, but nominal in the sense that they don't practice their faith. And where they're all ending up in the growth of the church there are these big Pentecostal churches and evangelical Pentecostal churches, because it's so exciting, and they're hearing preaching, and they're hearing the gospel, and they're hearing this. And what you hear when you go to Brazil, or you go to Colombia, or you go to Central America, because I've been in those house churches with those people, and they'll say, this now is what the church was always supposed to be. And, we've got a Catholic cathedral down the road with, 6 priests and a bishop who, never do anything with us. And I've never heard the Bible, and I never heard the gospel, and blah, 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 blah. And now I'm down the block at this house church thing. And so anyway, the reason I guess I'm dwelling on this is I think it's a real problem. I know it's a real problem in terms of numbers, because I suspect that, I could go in Holland and probably troll. I did. I was a pastor in Holland, and I had dozens and dozens and dozens of Catholics probably coming out of places like Our Lady of the Lake that came over and joined it. So part of it is if for us, we have to have an answer to that. And that's why I'm spending time talking about this, because when credo Catholics challenge us and make those assertions, we should be able to respond. So I'll stop talking, but that's why I think it's important to be able to understand this, so that when a friend or a child or a family member or whatever says, I'm out of here, I want to go to a Christian church because that's what the early church was supposed to be, and then the Catholic Church messed it all up, we have to be able to go back to the New Testament, to the book of Acts, and explain why that's not the case, and we should be able to respond. So I'll stop. That's my rant. I just went on a rant. But questions, thoughts, disagreement? Anybody ever heard that before from credo Catholics who bailed for Protestant churches?
Yes. Yeah, I have a son-in-law that has now converted to Baptist church. And we've got into some, I can't really answer some of his questions because he's constantly saying something out of the Bible. I don't know it as well.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's one of the challenges is they're going over and they're getting information. So they maybe have a pastor over there who's walking them through the stories of Paul. And then Paul did this, and here's what the early church like. And he can come up with dozens and dozens of examples in the New Testament. I used to stand up there in front of the room, and I'd have, my Bible open, and I'd say, hey, let's turn to Acts chapter 19, or let's turn to Acts chapter 21, and let's hear the story of this, let's hear the story of that. And then let's flip over here. Let's hear the story of the church at Philippi and how Paul established it with Lydia, this is the first believer there. And then let's turn over to Paul's letter to the Philippians and read the things he says to them. And then, you can walk them through a whole Bible study. And at the end of that, they're like, whoa, and they're unequipped to respond to that because, and again, I voted with my feet by joining the Catholic Church. I'm here doing what I'm doing because I voted for Catholicism on this, but I'm very aware of what's going on the other side of the fence. And so we need to be able to respond because we need to understand how the book of Acts and the New Testament establishes a view or a template for the church. And what I, again, saw over and over again was that a lot of Catholics haven't been equipped. It's not that there aren't great answers. And I think that my point is that I think that the right answer is Catholicism. But you have to be shown why that's the right answer. And you have to learn to read those passages because Protestants read them very differently. And when they present, it's very compelling.
You know, Greg, I think for a long time, the tradition of the Catholic Church had been the Baltimore Catechism. And
Right.
if you memorize that and don't ask questions about it,
Right.
you will be a good Catholic.
Right.
And so I think a lot of cradle Catholics, certainly people my age, felt that way.
Right.
And I have no doubt that some of them walked, but I have no doubt that some of them, some of them just quietly started learning on their own and discovering
Yeah,
this for themselves
absolutely.
without abandonment.
Yeah, no,
But then-
right. I agree, Marianne. Look, as far as the catechism is concerned, even the Baltimore Catechism, I mean, I'll shock people, but I actually like the Baltimore Catechism.
Well, it's pretty bad.
I'm a huge fan of it because it's simple, it's short,
Yeah.
and from a learning standpoint, I like learning. I mean, I think, and as a teacher, I think teaching people what are the 3 marks of this or what are the 4,
Right.
memorization. I mean, that's how you learn a lot of stuff, right? I mean, that's how we all kids learn our times tables. That's how we learn.
And it's not debatable. It's fact. There's no
fact.
debating it. It's
And-
not going to change.
Right. And so if you're, I think that I'm sort of a dinosaur on this. I'm a traditionalist when it comes to education and learning. I think there's certain information that you just need to learn. I mean, all of us, when we were kids, we learned our multiplication tables. We learned this. We learned that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And in 1776, they signed the Declaration of Independence. And then, blah, blah, blah. And Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address and whatever. And that in the first, I remember 7th grade, all of us, probably 7th grade civics class, when you studied the Constitution and you learned that there's 10 amendments to the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment has 5 freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom, right? I mean, all that stuff was sort of pounded in your memory and you walk away and go, okay, now I know that for the rest of my life. And there was a time where I think that kind of catechetical instruction gave people solid theological information about their faith.
Yep.
Now, the challenge, and I don't want to get into all the things that are, whatever we could go about the church. I think one of the things that what I saw as a Protestant pastor, a lot of Catholics come to me and ask me to baptize them. Okay. And what I saw as a teacher and a consultant and working with other churches in Africa and Latin America and other places like that, was that there is an energy when people grew up in very static Catholic churches, that when they would go to these evangelical churches and somebody standing up there with a Bible, somebody like me up there with a Bible and like for an hour, just like unpacking it and telling you these amazing stories. And they go, I've been sitting in, masses in my row, standing up, sitting down. They used to say, playing Simon Says, stand up, sit down, do this and that. And all of a sudden now somebody is telling these amazing stories. And then Paul went here and he did this and he did that. And let's turn to this page. And it's all coming alive for them. And that's super exciting. And so then they go, oh my gosh, the first time I'm hearing all of this. And that's not, my argument is not that we should have done away the catechism. I think we should have kept it. But my point is that when, the reason I'm only bringing this up tonight is that we as Catholics have should have a fantastic response when somebody comes and says, hey, the early church was just Paul traveling around to house churches. And there's a great answer to that, a great Catholic answer to that. But we haven't learned that Catholic answer. And so what happens is we end up going, oh, well, and there are Catholic, and so that's why I'm saying if we learn to understand who Paul was, what he was doing, what the relationship of the apostles were in the early church, what Peter's role was, what Paul's role was, how and why the book of Acts was written, how all those early letters of Paul came about and who they were written to. It doesn't undermine our Catholic faith, it actually supports it.
Mm-hmm.
But we got to learn that. And that's hence we're here tonight, right? I'm trying to make sense out of that. And part of that is to understand that as I said, the book of Acts is not just the story of establishing house churches as a template for the future. It's the story of how Peter established the governance of the church and Paul engaged in evangelization. And those two things are not opposed to each other, but the apostles work together that way. And so, second half of the book of Acts, focuses on the story of Paul's evangelization efforts. That's not a template for forever. It's just that the evangelization activity of the church should always continue. We should always be out there, sharing with converts. We should always be out there, right? Challenging the world, taking the gospel to the world. But that doesn't make what Peter was doing in the first half of the gospel, the book of Acts, go away. Did that make sense?
Mhm. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about Paul. Let's just talk about, we're talking all about Paul. Let's talk about Paul. Who was Paul? Well, Paul was born Saul of Tarsus, okay? And I'm gonna actually do a screen share with you here to show you a couple different things, give you some context. So here's our ancient Mediterranean world. And obviously Israel, Jerusalem. And Tarsus is actually here, right there. It's on the southern coast of Turkey, okay? And Paul was born and came from the city of Tarsus. He was educated in Jerusalem, okay? Just like, you would be born in Holland Mission, but go to college in, at Harvard or something in Boston, or you would go to travel somewhere else. He was educated under a Pharisee named Gamaliel. Gamaliel was like the most famous, well-regarded of the Pharisee teachers. So he had an education that was actually probably a good analogy, be somebody who goes to Harvard or goes to Oxford and gets a top-notch education from the greatest teachers. But he came from this town called Tarsus, and he was called Saul when he was in Jerusalem and being educated there. And he was of the tribe of Benjamin. He tells us himself, I was, born, circumcised on the 8th day of the tribe of Benjamin. His word is, I was a Hebrew among Hebrews. I was as pure a Hebrew as a Hebrew can be. And it's interesting because, and this will be, I think, relevant as we talk here this evening about who Paul was in his letters, is that he sometimes is defensive. Paul comes off in some of his letters a little bit defensive about his credentials. I can give you examples, but there's times when Paul kind of goes out of his way to stress how legitimate he is. Because when he's saying that he's a Hebrew among Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin, right, as pure a Hebrew as a Hebrew can be, he's always remembered that he didn't grow up in Jerusalem. He's not from there. He's from Tarsus. And it would be a little bit like, I think, somebody who maybe, is born in Holland, Michigan, and then goes off to Harvard or Oxford for their education, and then ends up working in some, on Wall Street or some, something. And it kind of is always a little bit defensive about how they came from, Holland, Michigan. They came from the Midwest, that somehow that they're not a part of that elite world. And I think that's always kind of interesting. But there's some things about being from Tarsus that make Paul uniquely qualified for what God chose him to do. So let's look at this map for just a second. Okay, here's Rome, obviously. And if we think about the Roman Empire, basically almost everything you see right now on the screen is the Roman Empire. That would be Rome ruled everything you can see on the screen, pretty much. But the kind of center of its empire, the sort of core of it, obviously is Italy and Greece, but it's these Mediterranean coasts. And this here is modern day Turkey, but it was called then Asia Minor, okay? And you can kind of figure out why. This would be Asia Major, and this little kind of part hanging off it would be like Little Asia. And this was probably one of the most prosperous and developed parts of the Roman Empire. And what it was is, if you look at my mouse right now, my cursor, it was along the coasts and into these regions, or maybe up into these central highlands. This was in many ways, the most wealthy and sophisticated part of the Roman Empire. It's by no accident that when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, he divided the empire into two halves, an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire, and he established himself in the East, because this was actually the rich, wealthy, sophisticated part of the Roman Empire, because it inherited all those earlier empires from the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks. It was very developed. And it also had this coast here, and all of the coastal trade, all the shipping. And then throughout Turkey, there's roads, ancient roads, and all of these things. And all of these cities, like this is Galatia, Paul's letter to the Galatians, Ephesus, all of these letters that you read from Paul, all of his missionary journeys are to these churches in this Asia Minor region. And again, it's very Roman. It's not Jewish at all, although there are Jews who live there. It's not Jewish, it's Greco-Roman. The primary language would be Greek, but it's under the Romans. And, probably over making the point, but if you think about modern day equivalents, I mean, these cities are your Paris, your New York, your Los Angeles, your San Francisco, your Shanghai. These are those kinds of sophisticated global cities all through here. So why am I telling you all this? Well, God chose Saul to be his missionary apostle. And Saul is defensive in his letters when he's talking to the Jews, because the Jews are like, you're not really a Jew. I mean, yeah, you kind of came down here and studied, you kind of went to college here, but you're not from here. And he goes out of his way to say, I'm just as Hebrew or more Hebrew than you. But they were always suspicious of him because he really wasn't from here. However, when God is looking for somebody to be the apostle to the Gentiles, who does he choose? Somebody from this Greco-Roman world. And so when Paul goes out to Galatia, which is where my cursor is now, or Cilicia, or Ephesus, and all of these kinds of cities, Paul is essentially a native of those places. He's from there. He speaks that language. He probably speaks Greek as a first language, and Hebrew as his second language. Like he grew up in his home reading and learning Hebrew to study the scriptures, but his probably first language growing up in Tarsus would have been the commercial Greek of this world. And he knows this world. This is where he's from. So I think it's fascinating that when God is looking for somebody to be the apostle to the Gentiles, he chooses this man Saul from Tarsus, and Paul's missionary journeys are throughout the region here to establish churches, essentially where he came from. And he's the perfect ambassador, the perfect missionary to them, rather than someone like Peter, who's a fisherman from Galilee and speaks Aramaic. There's no indication that Peter ever learned to speak Greek well, but certainly probably never spoke Latin. And in any case would have been a Hebrew from Galilee, and this is a foreign world to him. I think it's also interesting that at one point in the book of Acts, there's a conflict that arises, and it arises here in this city here that you call Antakya, but that's the modern Turkish spelling of it. It's Antioch. That's ancient Antioch, and you read about it all the time in the New Testament. And it was in Antioch that the first, Acts tells us that it was in Antioch that followers of Jesus were first called Christians. And this was really the church. There was the church in Jerusalem, and then the church in Antioch. And this was really the home base to the early missionary church. And at one point, there's a story about how Peter comes to Antioch, and Paul confronts him. Do any of you remember the story? Paul has this big argument with Peter, and this confrontation, because Peter comes up here, and when he's in Antioch, he's only hanging around with the Jewish Christians, people who speak Aramaic or Hebrew, who are from Israel, and they're up here in this foreign world, and Peter's sort of glomming on them because he's one of them. And Paul, who's from this region, has this confrontation with him and says, hey, look at all these converts who are Gentiles from these regions, they're Gentile Christians, and you're treating them as second-class citizens, Peter. So the first thing I want you to understand about Paul is that Paul is this really unique figure that God picks out because he's a Hebrew among Hebrews in terms of his genealogy through the tribe of Benjamin. And he has this first-class Hebrew education, but he's also a man of Asia Minor. And probably speaks, well, certainly did. Not probably did. I mean, all of his letters are written in Greek, and he's a master of the Greek language because it's his first language. Hebrew is not his first language, and or his native language. And here's one other thing about Paul that's super interesting and actually surprising to most people, is that while this was that sort of ancient Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire, it was under Roman rule, and Paul has Roman citizenship. So Saul is a citizen of Rome. And this becomes super, super important in the book of Acts to understand Paul's story. Because at one point, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem by the Jewish leaders. And they hand him over to the Roman authorities here in Caesarea Maritima. And when Saul goes before the Roman governor here, the Roman governor says, well, I'm going to convict you for violating Jewish laws and blah, 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 blah. And Paul says, no, you can't, because I am a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, I have the right to be tried under Roman law. And as a Roman citizen, I have a right to appeal under Roman law, appeal to Caesar. I have a right to have my case tried in Rome. And that's how Paul gets to Rome. So we know that Paul dies in Rome, right? Paul goes to Rome, established. The way Paul got to Rome was as a prisoner, because he appealed to Caesar, to the governor in Caesarea Maritima, who puts him on a boat guarded by Roman soldiers. So he's being, extradited. He's being extradited, and the boat takes him to Rome through a circuitous route, and they end up in Rome, and he's brought to Rome as somebody to have his case adjudicated. And so Paul's Roman citizenship is huge, and it allows him as a citizen to travel freely throughout the Roman world and access the Roman world in a way that Peter never could, in a way that James or John or the other apostles never could, because they were never Roman citizens. And Paul tells the story about how he obtained his Roman citizenship. At one point in the book of Acts, Roman centurion or Roman governor here in Caesarea Maritima says, well, how did you get your citizenship? I paid a price for mine, because you could essentially buy your citizenship, just like we can. You could immigrate to the United States and then go through citizenship things and pay all the legal fees and become a U.S. citizen. So when he was in Caesarea Maritima talking to this Roman official, this guy's like, I grew up somewhere in this area, but I had to pay for my citizenship. And Paul makes an important point. He says, I was born a citizen. His father was a Roman citizen. And he was born, just like we'd say, I was born a U.S. citizen, and you can't take my Roman citizenship away from me. And that all is because of his interesting origins and why Paul is such a unique figure, and that God could not have chosen. I mean, none of the other apostles, they all did amazing things, but none of them could have done exactly the thing that Paul did, which is another reason why I think that the second half of the book of Acts focuses on Paul more than on the other apostles, because the theme or the story is the evangelization of the Roman world, and Paul was the man God chose and made an apostle specifically to do that task. Paul was not chosen by God to establish the governance of the church. He wasn't chosen by God to establish the liturgy of the church. He wasn't chosen by God to establish the discipline of the church. He wasn't chosen by God to write a gospel. The other apostles did those things. It's part of my Catholic answer to Protestants, is that focusing on Paul is only focusing on kind of one apostle and one specific task, albeit an important task. And here's one other thing, and I'll stop talking and let you guys ask questions about Paul, that I think is really interesting. So I keep going back and forth between using the names Saul and Paul. And there is a very common misconception. The popular misconception is that God renamed Saul Paul after his conversion. Okay? In the same way that he renamed Simon to Peter. But that's not what happened at all. There is no record at all that God renames Saul Paul. In fact, it's the exact opposite. And this is really surprising because I think it's a natural assumption. You can see there's multiple characters in the Bible who have one name, and then God, sort of like Abram becomes Abraham, or Jacob becomes Israel, or Simon becomes Peter. And so God changes their names. So when people see Saul, and then all of a sudden now he's Paul, they go, well, God changed his name because of his conversion. Not what happened. Here's the story. Paul had two names. He grew up in that Roman world I was describing to you, and he had essentially a Roman name. Paulus was a popular Roman name, and his father being a citizen, his father was a tradesman, businessman, made tents, as a craftsman, and he was a citizen of the Roman Empire there in Tarsus. And just like, okay, you know how when people would come to Ellis Island, immigrants, and they would have some unpronounceable name back in the old country, and they'd get to America and they'd be given a new name. Like I grew up in LA, and when I was in high school was when all the Vietnamese immigrants came. In fact, my high school, like when I was in 9th grade, it was like 90% Anglo. And by the time I was a senior in high school, we were like 30 or 40% Vietnamese, because that was in the late 70s when all of the Vietnamese immigrants were coming in and they were being resettled right in Orange County. And they would always say, well, so I knew a lot of them. And they would say, well, my Vietnamese name is, and they would say something I could never pronounce. And it's like, but call me Dave, right? And they would come and they would sort of get an American name, right? Well, what was going on with Saul is a Hebrew name. Okay? So, like King Saul from the Old Testament, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was probably the most famous person from the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul, other than Benjamin himself. So Saul's parents in Tarsus named him Saul after, King Saul. That's his Hebrew name. But because they were Roman citizens, they would have had a Roman name. And so Paul likely had a name like Marius Decius Paulus, right? Because there's this thing, just like we have a first name and a last name, one's a family name, and so Romans have this triple name system. It gets complicated. One's your personal name, one's your family name, but so Paul probably had a name like Marius Decius Paulus. But to the Hebrews at Hebrew school and in the synagogue, he would go by his Jewish name. And his parents, as good Jews, but also good Roman citizens, he would have his Roman name that would be entered into the Roman courts and Roman doing business. And also the Romans had trouble pronouncing Hebrew words, just like I'd have trouble pronouncing like the Vietnamese name. So you call him Dave, even though his name is something in Vietnamese I can't say. And so Paulus was Saul's Roman name. And one of the arguments that scholars have about this is that whether Paulus was actually like his first name or his last name in the Roman, like, you know, so, you know, Bob Nida, right, is Paulus the Bob part or the Nida part? Because it could go either way. Where Paul, at no point in the book of Acts does it say God renamed him. Here's where he starts using the word Paul. Let me go back here one more time to show you this. So there's a particular point in the book of Acts where they were referring to him as Saul, and then they switch. Luke switches and starts using the word Paul. And it's when Paul goes on his first missionary journey, and he starts going among these cities. And when he starts going among these cities, which are these Roman Empire cities, and he walks into them, he starts using his Roman name, which is his name. But it would be like, yeah, that immigrant to the United States saying, well, when I go back to the old country, I use the unpronounceable name, but in here, I'm talking to these people, so I'm going to use my Roman name. In fact, when he's tried by this guy in Caesarea Maritima, the magistrate's name is Paulus. That's why it's very likely that that's a last name. It's like a family name, because he's tried by this guy named Paulus, that's his last name. And Paul says, well, you know, I'm Paulus too, and I can talk Roman. I can speak in that world. I know how to move in that world. And so instead of walking around this world and stressing that I'm this Hebrew, because that doesn't mean anything to these people, he speaks to them in their terms. And he essentially, at one level, is saying, you know, I'm one of you. I can speak Greek as well as you. I'm from Asia Minor. I can speak Greek. I'm a Roman citizen. I'm, Mercius Decius Paulus. And he sort of starts using his Roman name. And he starts being referred to that way. But his name doesn't change. If there's any sense of it changing, it's just that in his role as a missionary to the Gentiles, he uses his Gentile name. So, how many of you knew that? Because I think the popular conception is that Paul's name was changed like Peter.
Yep.
Yeah, that's just the natural assumption. But I think that the other one is actually more interesting. I mean, it's true because, again, there's nothing in the New Testament that says his name gets changed. God doesn't change his name. But I think that it makes it makes it so much more interesting. You know, when you're reading reading Acts and you're reading the letters of Paul, you're understanding this is the man who kind of knows how to move in two worlds. He knows how to be the Hebrew among Hebrews, you know, the student of the great Gamaliel, the Pharisee among Pharisees. But he's also kind of a Greco-Roman among Greco-Romans. And so among all these people, God, Christ picks him out to be the guy who's so uniquely qualified to be the apostle of the Gentiles. And when you think about Peter and Paul together, of course, you go to Rome and you see all the monuments, you see the tombs and you see the monuments, you see all the places like in St. Peter's Square where you see the giant statues of Peter and Paul side by side. And it's just so fascinating to think about these two men and how different they were, how different their backgrounds were, how different their lives were, how God chose both of them for their unique qualities and unique abilities and used them in such unique and complementary ways. And that's why I think when sort of Protestants try to set up Paul as a kind of a Protestant pope, and downgrade Peter, it just misses the whole point. Peter is that rock of faith, and he comes, from that Jewish world, and his talent is to be the leader. Peter's not a scholar. He wasn't raised among the rabbis. He isn't a great debater. He isn't a great, but what Peter is a leader. and he's strong as a leader. And so his role, he's given the keys of the kingdom to govern the early church. Paul is the great intellectual, the great traveler, the great presenter, the man who could move through all of these Greco-Roman cities and razzle and dazzle these Roman officials, up to including the point that at the end of his life, when he's under house arrest in the city of Rome, he's persuading and converting the Roman Praetorian Guard, we read, because he has the capacity to sit and, be so interesting and persuasive and speak to these kind of Roman Praetorian guards on the Palatine Hill and speak to them in their language and in their terms and understand their culture. So that's why Peter and Paul are just these fascinating sort of twin figures who bring so much to the church, and only Christ could have picked them and established them in those roles. So I'm going to stop there. Again, I've been on a little bit of a rant, and I didn't want this to be so lectury, but thoughts, share, comments, questions. Does that surprise anybody in terms of how you think of St. Paul?
It does me.
Yeah. It's kind of, I think, not how we normally, it's not that we've ever been taught something different, but it's a different way to sort of understand him. It's the not different way, it's the true way, but it's a perspective to really unpack who he uniquely was. And it makes, actually, I think, the story more amazing.
Well, it also makes you think of him more as a human being rather than some mystical saint.
Right. I was waiting for the right moment to bring this up, and I think this is probably the right moment. So I don't know, for those of you on Facebook, I don't know if you have the ads on Facebook. So I don't know what ads you see, but about a couple of months ago, I started seeing ads on Facebook for this new, it's a TV series, except it's not on TV. It's only on the internet. So it's a series produced directly for the web called The Chosen, about the apostles. Have you seen this?
No.
Okay. I'll send you a link. So what this is there's a group of Christian filmmakers, and they said, we're going to produce a multi-season, like TV series, multi-season series on the life of Jesus and the apostles. And what's unique about it is they said we're going to crowdfund it, which means kind of like what do you call it? GoFundMe type thing. Mm-hmm. So that users are going to start, contributing money, and we're going to raise money, and we're going to shoot this. And their whole idea was to do something really different, to really bring and tell the story of Jesus and the apostles in a sort of a fresh new way, to really. And so anyway, I started seeing ads for this thing a couple of months ago on Facebook, and I was so busy with so many other things that I kept wanting to get around to it. And the way you watch is on Facebook. There's an app that you download. So if you go to Facebook and you look for this Facebook app for The Chosen. In fact, while we're talking here, I'll bring it up and show you. And so I watched season 1. And then as you watch it, they ask you to pay it forward and contribute to, making it possible for other people to pay season 2. So I gave them a contribution to produce season 2. And I was like, okay, is this going to be good or bad or whatever? I thought it was great. Now it's kind of Protestant-y, but I think it's just really super faithful to the Gospels. What I've seen so far is they just have 8 episodes in the first season. So it's basically the life of Jesus up till, it doesn't show the nativity, but it basically starts with Jesus, the beginning of his ministry up to where he meets the Samaritan woman at the well. And that's the first 8 episodes. So it's basically the calling of the apostles is the first season. And the reason I'm telling you all this is, I'm going to try to bring it up and show you, because how it presents the calling of the calling of the 12. That's really the topic of the first season. It's called The Chosen, and how they were the chosen. And it's so interesting how, and I think it's probably the best job I've seen of any kind of a film about the life of Jesus. And I watched an interview with a filmmaker, and he said the problem with almost every Jesus movie is with the apostles is you have Peter and then you have the other 11 guys. And they're all kind of guys with long hair and robes and sandals, and they just don't. And what he really wanted to do was give each of the apostles unique personalities and unpack kind of their backstory and show how different they were, and why Jesus sort of picked them and how he picked them. And I think it does a really remarkable job. And the reason I'm sharing this with you now is that it shows the choosing of Peter, and doesn't show Paul yet, but this whole thing about how God picked Peter and Paul and the other apostles, and what qualities they had and how he utilized them, and what he saw in them. So if you watch this Chosen series, one of the things that's really fascinating is the choosing of Matthew. So they do an awful lot with the whole process of like over 3 or 4 episodes of Matthew, the tax collector, and developing the character up to the point, like I think it was in the second to last episode 7 or something, where Jesus comes by the tax booth and says, "Matthew, follow me." And the way that they've sort of built that all up, it's like, oh my gosh, it's so surprising. In the case of this guy, Matthew, they show him as a guy with Asperger's syndrome. So, kind of like somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And, he's sort of shunned by his society because he's chosen to be a tax collector because he's really good with numbers and details. And he's sort of like super fascinated with numbers and details. He's really good at writing things down. And they go through this whole thing. And well, finally, Jesus says, Matthew, come and follow me. So he comes and follows. And then you have Matthew, who's just meticulously recording everything that Jesus says, like scribbling it down, writing it down, and, counting. Because when you read Matthew's gospel is so much more detailed than the other gospels. And, he's in there and he's counting the loaves and the fishes. And he gives you all of these details in Matthew that you don't get in the other gospels. And so the filmmakers are trying to say, hey, look, if you really understand who these men were and what they were, each of them was unique, and they brought something unique to the role as an apostle, how fascinating that is. And that's where I'm saying, when you understand who Paul was, it makes what Paul did, and it makes Paul's letters so much more comprehensible. So when we're reading, the epistle to this or that church, you started reading it through the lens of this complex person who moves in these two worlds and has established things and is able to move back and constantly be on the move and manage all of this. And I think it also diffuses like what I began by talking about tonight, this sort of Protestant, I think, notion that Paul is the real leader of the early church and Peter is the secondary figure. Because again, what they're doing is they have different roles. Peter has the keys. He governs. He leads. Paul is this unique ambassador and evangelizer. So again, let me pause. Any questions or thoughts or whatnot? Is this helpful to you in terms of thinking about kind of understanding and processing how you read the New Testament? I hope it is.
It definitely is for me.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on and talk about Paul's epistles and his specific missionary journeys, because we've got all these epistles of Paul, and by the way, epistle is just a fancy. It's not fancy. It's the Greek word for letter. So a lot of times we talk about the epistles, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. They're called the epistles, except that we're just using a Greek word. So if you say the letter to the Romans, or you say the letter to the Galatians, you're saying the same thing as the epistle to the Galatians. You're just using the English words of the Greek word. So Paul writes these letters, and in your workbook that I had given you, and I'll find that here and pull that up, I laid out what those are. Here we go. Let me share this screen with you. Not that you've not seen this before, but let me just make a couple of points. So you should be seeing this grid here. This is, these are Paul's epistles. And I organized them not in the order that they're in the, I made this chart not in the order that they're in your Bible, but in the order in which they were written. So again, let's bear in mind, Jesus was executed somewhere approximately around 30 or 31 AD. So when we're reading about the events in, say, like Pentecost and the establishment, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost, we're talking 30, 31, 32, depending on your dating system. And then Paul is converted a year or 2 or 3 after that. And then he spends 3.5 years in Antioch, where I showed you earlier, learning about the faith. And during that time, particularly learning from the other apostles or people who had known Jesus, all about the stories of Jesus. So Paul was he had this great Old Testament education. Now he's getting all the new information about the Christ booted up so that he can go out and start sharing it. And then he starts traveling on his missionary journeys. And the first of the letters is written in 52. So this is not 20 years after the events of, Holy Week. So again, to put that in maybe in some context for ourselves, if we think about 20 years ago was 9/11, and we start thinking about all the events of 9/11 and immediately afterwards and all of that, a lot of us remember that very clearly. We remember where we were. We remember what we did. We remember what happened with the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq. We knew people. Some of us know people who served. Some of us knew people who lost their lives, or family members who lost their lives or whatnot, right? And so all of that's very fresh in our memories. So to give that context, when Paul is writing these letters, it's all fresh. The events of the Christ and the early church are all very fresh in people's minds, for people who knew those people who were involved. And it's very immediate. So we get 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 52, 53. And then you can see Galatians, Corinthians, all written here in a 2 to 3 year, 4 year window. Romans, and so on and so forth. The last letters that are written are Timothy, the 2 Timothys, and Titus. And they're written, particularly 2 Timothy, is written while Paul is in prison for the second and last time. And Bob, when we were in Rome 6 months ago and we stopped in the Forum at the Mamertine prison there, we weren't able to go in that day because of the rain and whatnot. But that's where Paul was held in the Mamertine prison there right before his execution, just outside the city wall. And that's where he wrote 2 Timothy. He wrote Philemon from his first house arrest there. But again, even that is only 30 years. So the production of these letters all takes place from 52 to 66 over essentially what's a 25-year period. So all of Paul's letters are speaking to a very specific time. They're all concentrated on these incredible events that are all taking place. And for example, also, the Great Fire of Rome, which precipitated the Christians being persecuted by the Emperor Nero, occurs in 64. So there were these 9/11-like events. My point is all of the epistles, all of the letters of Paul are written in a very condensed period of time. It's a super active period of what's going on in the world, super active period of what's going on in the church, super active period of what's going on in the broader Roman world. And the point I was making earlier about when I would have cradle Catholics come to me after, we would do a Bible study or some kind of I would teach a teaching session or something at a church, and they would come up and they'd say, "Oh, this is all so exciting and dynamic to learn about all of this." You go, well, it was an exciting and dynamic time. I don't know that those exciting and dynamic events of those first 10 or 20 years that Paul was writing during it, that's a template for the next 2000. He was writing, it all seems very exciting because it was very exciting. I mean, it was new churches, conversions, exploding of new churches, persecutions, all these amazing things going on. And so reading about it, yeah, it's incredibly exciting to read about. It's a good question whether that should be a template for the church for all time. And just to give you some context, this is where those locations were. So Thessalonica, up here in Greece, that's the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, letters of Thessalonians. Philippi, right up here in just northern part of Greece, is the letter to the Philippians, obviously. Corinthians, Ephesians, Ephesus right here. We're still hoping that we're going to Turkey here in December, and we'll be going to Ephesus while we're there. Colossae is a region right here just away off from Tarsus. Remember, we've been saying Paul grew up here. This is his hometown. And so when he was traveling in this kind of province of Colossia or the province of Galatia, all these little cities through here, he's essentially in his home district and establishing those churches. He was not some weird Hebrew from Jerusalem or some weird Hebrew from Galilee as a foreigner. He was one of those people. And then this would be his missionary journeys. So Paul takes a series of these missionary journeys. And this is in your handout. If you find it, or I can email it to you. But there's any good study Bible has a map of this, and you can find maps of Paul's missionary journeys on Google in about 2 seconds, 1,000 of them. But here you see his first missionary journey begins in Antioch, that city right here that I pointed out, that was really the home of the early missionary church. And his first missionary journey just takes him through this southern region back to his hometown of Tarsus. So his first missionary journey is just basically going among not his Hebrew people, because he was really kind of this amphibious creature, right? I mean, he was half Hebrew, and he was a Hebrew and by training, a Hebrew by descent, a Hebrew by training, a Hebrew by spirituality and mind, but he was very much a Greco-Roman citizen of Asia Minor. And his first missionary journey just takes him through basically his hometown region. And he has a lot of success on that region in that missionary journey because he's able to come into those cities and say, hey, I'm Paulus, and I'm able to speak to you in fluent Greek, and I understand your culture, and I'm able to preach to you. And he enjoys great success with that. His second missionary journey takes him further afield. He moves back through those same cities, and that's when he comes up to Ephesus, and he comes up here to, this is where my cursor is right now, is where this is where Istanbul is right now, or Constantinople is. But the Sea of Marmara, this is the division between sort of Asia and Europe. So remember, this is called Asia Minor. If you go across the Black Sea and up north and east of that, you get into Russia, Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia. And we read in the book of Acts, it's Acts 16, 17, that when Paul was here, his intention was to actually go up through the Black Sea to these Roman cities that line the Black Sea, and his goal was to go up into Asia. There's a whole Roman world up in here, and what he wanted to do was to take the gospel to Asia. That was Paul's ambition. But he has a dream when he's in Troas, right here. And right before he buys his ticket to go up that way, he sees a man from Greece, man from Macedon in a dream. And the man from Macedon is saying, come to us. And so he sees this as a sign from the Lord that he's not to go to Asia, but he's going to go to Greece. So he crosses the Hellespont, and he crosses over into, this is now Europe. Once you're here, you're in Asia Minor. Once you cross over this short water here, you're now officially in Europe. And he goes to, this is one of my favorite stories. So when I was in seminary, we had to develop our first kind of sermons, and then we used to go out on the road and take these to all these churches and preach our first sermon out of our file. And when I travel around as a young pastor, my sort of go-to sermon when I was invited to travel and speak somewhere, my go-to thing out of my file was to tell the story of the conversion of a woman named Lydia in Philippi, which occurs in Acts. And it's the story about how Paul is here, and he goes, because of this dream, he goes up to Macedon. And the first place he goes is this city here that you see called Neapolis. And obviously in Greek, that's like new city. And you notice that it's in big letters, because like on maps, the bigger the letters, the more population a city has. And notice that Neapolis is bigger and has a bigger dot than Athens. This was a huge Roman city, Greco-Roman city. Huge commercial center, military center, government center. Neapolis was a big deal. Neapolis was a Los Angeles. It was a Miami. It was a, big deal. And he goes there and he tries to make some converts, and he gets nowhere. And so then what he does is he heads up the road to this place called Philippi. It's a smaller little town. And he goes to Philippi and he goes into the synagogue. This is how the story goes in Acts. He goes to the synagogue on Philippi and on the Sabbath, and he's going to preach to any Jews there that the Messiah has come, which is kind of his methodology. But there is no synagogue. He wants to go to the synagogue. There is not one. Because in order to have a synagogue, you needed 12 Jewish men of age. Okay? So who had gone through bar mitzvah and were considered of legal age. You had to have 12 Jewish men to form a synagogue. Because there's no synagogue in Philippi, there's not 12 Jews. Or not 12 Jewish men. So Paul says he's discouraged because it's like, well, this is a wasted trip. Maybe I misinterpreted the dream. And so what he does is it says that he and his traveling companions, including Luke, they went down by the river where they heard there were some women that used to go down and do their wash by the river. They go beat the laundry on the rocks or whatever. And you think about the great Paulus, this great figure, this intellectual, this giant, this apostle, and God has led him to Europe. He's crossed over into Europe, and he's reduced in a sense to going down to the creek to talk to some washerwomen. And when he's down there and he's talking to the washerwomen, there's a woman named Lydia, who she is a dealer in purple dye. Purple color, dye, which was used for making clothes and all that. And he shares the gospel with her, and she greatly rejoices. She invites all her friends over to her house, and he stays with them for a couple of weeks, instructing them in the gospel. And when I used to do this sermon in my file, my sort of go-to sermon in the first few years after I got ordained, what I used to say is that, we never know where our missionary or evangelistic efforts will take us. Because Paul thought he was supposed to go to Asia and speak to the great cities of Asia. God leads him over, and it's not to the Neapolis. It's not to the men of Philippi. It's some washerwomen down here that God leads him to. That's why God brought him over there. And Lydia is the first European convert, first recorded European convert in the New Testament. She's the first person in the New Testament who's named, a European who's named as converting. And I find that fascinating. that the first European convert is a washerwoman down by a creek. And then from there, of course, all of Europe would be. So on this missionary journey, Paul is doing some amazing things. Then he travels down, goes to Athens, speaks to the great philosophers and what in Athens. And then he works his way back here to Jerusalem. And that's his second missionary journey. And along the way, he's establishing these churches and revisiting these churches and setting all these churches up. And as he's going along, he's also writing letters. So Paul's pattern would be, he would go into a church, to a city, he would, preach, he would convert some people, baptize them, whatnot. He would establish them, stay with them for a few weeks or a few months until they were sort of established, appoint some elders and some leadership, and then he'd move on to another city. And then when he would get to the, as he would travel along, messengers, he would get basically mail, because the Roman world had a very developed mail system. So maybe he would, establish a church here in Cilicia or Cappadocia or Galatia, and then he would be up in Troas or Neapolis, and there would be a message waiting for him. There would be mail, because it would come on a ship. And he would read it, and they would say, hey, back in Galatia, all this stuff is going down in the church at Galatia. So-and-so is doing such and such, and this other person in the church is teaching this, and is this heresy, what this guy is saying, and what should we do about this problem, and this conflict has arisen, or these disciplinary matters. And Paul says, oh my gosh. So he scratches out a letter to the Galatians and sends it by messenger back to them. And so those epistles we have of Paul are really these active letters that accompany him in this traveling around and establishing of churches, and then instructing those people after he leaves about how to deal with problems that arise. So what Paul didn't do was sit down in some systematic way and write up a textbook or a catechism for the church. And I think this is a huge point of how you can misread, and I think Protestants do, I did, misread the letters of Paul, because Marianne, you mentioned a catechism. They are not a catechism. Right. They are occasional circumstantial letters that Paul is basically writing that were responding to the problems that are popping up in these churches. So for example,
specific to those churches.
Yeah, specific to those churches, those circumstances. And of course, we can generalize from them. So for example, let's talk about Galatia. One of the big themes of Paul's letter to the Galatians is the conflict between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And by what I mean by that is Christians who were Jews before they converted to Christianity versus people who were Gentiles when they converted to Christianity, right? So people who were faithful Jews, when they converted to Christianity, they thought they were supposed to continue all of their Jewish customs. They thought, they still thought they needed to, circumcision and the dietary laws and all those kinds of things, right? Well, what happens is Paul gets up here into Greece and a letter arrives to him. Because again, the Roman world was very sophisticated, and you could put something in the mail. The Romans had basically a mail system. And you could post something and it would travel by ship and messengers or whatnot, and it would get to wherever you want to send it to here. Well, obviously it wouldn't find you. It wasn't like email, but you would get to Neapolis and it would be like a message waiting for you. So he's here and he gets this message from Galatia. And it says that after Paul set up the churches in Galatia and he left, the Jewish Christians began asserting themselves and demanding that the Gentile Christians conform to all the Jewish ceremonial laws. Up to and including, they were demanding that the Gentile Christians be circumcised, physically circumcised, or they couldn't be Christians. The argument being that Christianity, Jesus was a Jew, it's a continuation of the Old Testament, and that if you don't get circumcised, then you haven't really adopted the religion of Jesus. Paul gets so angry that he fires off this letter. And if you read Galatians, it is a rant. It is an epic rant. And he fires off this epic rant to the circumcisers in Galatia. And he says, how dare you burden your brothers, the Gentile brothers you have, with these laws, and you're completely misunderstanding what Christianity is. And then he says, and I kid you not, we're all adults here, and it's in the Bible, but he says, if they are so enthusiastic about circumcision, and I am not making this up, you can look it up after I get off. He says, I wish they would go all the way and cut it off. If they're so eager to cut off foreskins, then they should just keep on going. He says, by all means, their enthusiasm, they continue. I mean, he says that in colloquial terms, but he's pretty clear about it. He goes, I wish they would. It depends on your translation, your English translation. It says, if they're so enthusiastic about circumcision, then they might as well go ahead and mutilate themselves, which is mean keep on going. I mean, that's pretty, that's an epic rant, right? Now, Marianne, to your point, is that's a problem that arose in Galatia. And when we read Galatians, part of our hermeneutic, our interpretation, is to go, okay, when we're reading Paul speaking to a specific situation in a given city, how much of that can we generalize to the church in all times and places? Now, the most controversial example of that is when Paul, in a couple of his letters, says that women should shut up in church. Right?
I read that one.
Yeah.
That was Corinthians, 14.
That these women should shut up in church, and he says if they have a question, they should wait till they get home and ask their husband. Now, that's not a very popular teaching in today's world, right? But for 2,000 years, in defense, for 2,000 years, Christians have struggled. Priests and bishops and theologians and teachers or whatnot have struggled. When Paul says something in one of his letters, how much can that be generalized, or how much of that was specific to that church in that city at that moment? Because when he's talking about that, one of the things he's talking about is there was chaos going on in the church. There's a couple of letters where he talks about gossiping busybody women that are undermining the leadership of the church. And so he's like, look, because again, he gets a letter or he gets a messenger who says, you can't believe what's going on back in Ephesus, or you can't believe what's going on back in Galatia. I mean, there's these ladies have taken over, they're shouting down the pastor can't get through the homily, can't do the Eucharist, they're disruptive. And so he fires off a letter and says, hey, y'all knock it off. Now, are we to generalize from that in all times and in all places, women should shut up and go home and ask their husband? And all I'm trying to say is that's why understanding Paul's letters is super important to being able to know how to read them, understand how they're written and why they're written, and these circumstances is super important to be able to read them theologically and biblically and apply them.
When you think about it, two things, maybe not necessarily in defense of these women, but two things that come from maybe Paul's experience growing up. Jewish women did remain quiet. They were in a separate room for prayer. They remained quiet. They had nothing to say. They followed along. The other thing is that in these house churches, the women were the hosts, and the women were the ones who were making the bread to be broken, and they were the ones who basically were setting everything up. So they did have a say-so then.
Right.
And they probably saw a lot of logic to what they were doing and how things were being done, to what was being said. And I can see where they're saying, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. We have to do it this way.
Right.
That makes
I mean, I think that's a legitimate thing. I mean, like my entire adult ministry life, I've been in 10,000 arguments about that in churches, and what did Paul mean and how much does it apply today? And my general gloss on that is, and I'm only using this as an example of how you have to read the epistles, and you read what's in them, because you have to look at them and ask, to what degree is that generalized? And then you have to have, and to do that, you have to have some understanding of the circumstances under which they were written and why they were written and who wrote them and the time and the place, as you're pointing out, Marianne. I think my personal takeaway from that is that Paul, and when you look at the totality of what Paul writes in all of his epistles, and you look at the totality of the New Testament and everything else, that there is an order. There's good order in the church is important, right? That discipline and order and decorum is important in the church. And so that's not to say that all women in all times and all places should shut up and go home and ask their husband, but that Paul was seeing this as a violation of order. And in this particular instance, you have whatever was going on there, you had some disruptive individuals. But that in that culture, you know, and again, these are the things. Another place he says that women should keep their heads covered in church. So you again go, well, you know, I mean, are women all supposed to wear hats or veils, right? And there's another place where he says women shouldn't cut their hair. Okay? That their hair is their glory. There's another thing where, you know, he talks about in his letter to the Corinthians, and that's where understanding that. See, that's why I think this kind of historical understanding of Paul's, of the book of Acts, and this sort of historical understanding of Paul's missionary journeys opens up, you know, the New Testament letters of Paul to you. Because, and they become very practical issues, because when we argue about issues in church, theological issues, spiritual issues, right, liturgical issues in church, and we have all these, you know, arguments, and then what we do is we go proof text. Well, it says in Galatians this, or it says in Ephesians this, or it says this. You go, right, but we need to understand those letters in their context. And that's not to say that, because I don't think that everything is just localized. I think you make some points that are generalized, and you make some that aren't. And so you have to make this effort to understand these in order to make sense out of it. Now, not every lay person can invest a lifetime in biblical studies and historical studies. That's why we have, you know, teachers and pastors, and we have popes and theologians, and, you know, for 2,000 years, right, these things have been written on, and we, you know, can go to the compendium of those things like the catechism and see how it's been distilled through magisterial teaching over the centuries, right? But it's still important to go back and understand them, because every time, you know, you get in an argument with somebody, they'll flip their Bible and say, well, it says in Ephesians, or it says in Galatians, blah, 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 or in Thessalonians, and so therefore, and you go, right, but don't take it out of context. Right. So, you know, like, for example, another one is you know, what was going on in Corinth. Corinth was a hot mess. I mean, Corinth was a hot mess of a church. You know, Corinth was the San Francisco of its day. It was this huge trading city, but it was also super licentious. It was wealthy. It was a seaport that, you know, all of this trade of the ancient world went through. It had money and banking, but it was also sexually immoral, and entertainment centers. And, you know, like I said, it was kind of almost like a San Francisco of its day. And Paul goes there, establishes a church, right? And all kinds of crap is going on in that church. Paul leaves, and he gets all these letters from people going, you can't believe the crap that's going back in the Corinthian church. You go, well, actually, I kind of can, because I know these Corinthians. It's be like, you can't believe what's going on in the church in San Francisco. And you go, yeah, I probably can't believe what's going on in the church in San Francisco. Up to and including a guy's living with his, what was it, his daughters. There's incest going on. There's this, there's that. There's all this kind of crap. And Paul's scribbling off these letters to them going, knock it off, guys. And I think what's super, super interesting also is that in most of Paul's letters, he's actually responding to questions they're asking. So he'll say in his epistles, I hear that, or you ask about, or such and such. So they're basically sending a messenger to him going, what should we do about this? And he rattles something off. And sometimes he does about liturgy. So here's another example where he talks in one of his epistles about the Eucharist, okay? And Protestants love to go on about pulling some quotes from Paul about that out of what I think is out of context. But Paul talks about how in your fellowship meals you should do this and this and this, and you shouldn't sit with divisions. And you go, and then Protestants will generalize from that and say, well, see, the Eucharist shouldn't be this formal thing like Catholics make. It should be like a fellowship meal. We should all sit around and break a loaf and, you know, have a glass of wine and fellowship. And you go, right, but that's not the Eucharist. right? And so you're taking Paul talking, responding to a question that they're asking about fellowship meals and how they should treat their fellowship meals, and you're generalizing that to the Eucharist. But again, in order to make sense out of this, you have to understand the how, the who, what, where, when, and why of the writing of these. And I think that because they occupy so many pages of the New Testament, they're just full of all kinds of stuff that gets misread.
Right.
So does Peter ever have a response to all this going on?
What was that, Bob?
Does Peter ever have a response to all this going on in the church that he's governing?
Well, it's interesting. So we have 2 epistles from Peter, and I'll talk about those next week, the epistles of Peter. Peter writes 2 epistles, and they're more general about the church as a totality. So Peter doesn't seem to be diving into the specifics of what's going on in these missionary churches that Paul's, but part of that is also time and the distance of the ancient world, because these things are happening in real time. In some cases, Paul is setting up a church and then 6 months later getting a letter from them and firing off a response. And Peter is 1,000 miles away. What you get in Peter's letters is him speaking to the church as a whole. And we'll talk about those next week. In the first and second epistle of Peter, first and second letters of Peter, he's kind of talking to the church in its totality.
And what's interesting is I almost look at Paul, he's founding these churches and he's converting people and he's bringing the churches on board, but he's really working within the community first.
Yeah.
So it's almost, the church, I think, is there. That's his passion, but it's the community that he has to overcome. Yeah. So he really goes into these communities with his passion and, garners what he can from that, in spite of all of their ups and their downs. Right. They're being baptized, but who can blame them for totally not turning away from all of their old habits?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Because they grew up just like we. So we look at it as Americans, right? We're the products of this sort of 20th, 21st century consumerist luxury culture. I mean, we value individual freedom, very highly. We're very individualistic, consumeristic. We have all of our own cultural baggage, and then we bring that into the church. So when I was a consultant to all these big mega churches around the world, what we were trying to do is figure out how to get people to go to church like they would go to the mall. So almost all the churches that I used to consult with, a standard thing in the late 90s and early 2000s was to have a Starbucks in the lobby. And you could do it. I mean, you go to Starbucks just like you have a Starbucks at the grocery store. So Starbucks has like 2 kinds of franchises. One is like the standalone franchise, and the other is like a what do they call, like a kiosk. And so what we would do is we would set up and call Starbucks and say, I want to set up a Starbucks kiosk. So we'd have all these mega churches, and in the lobby there's a bookstore and a Starbucks. Because when people come, get your Starbucks, get yourself mocha frappa, half calf, whatever, thing. And then, you can sit in church and then, right, with your fancy drink. And, the premise being that if you want to reach modern people, you have to, adapt to their culture. And so we're very much products of our own sort of cultures. And to your point, Marianne, they were products of their cultures. And I think the church is always, the gospel is by definition, Christ is countercultural.
Absolutely.
And he came to challenge the cultures of the world. Their world, our world, wherever you are. To be a Christian is to be countercultural, swim against the culture of the world, wherever that is. And so, it's interesting to think if Paul were to come to us and he were to, critique what we do, what would he say? Would he say, oh my gosh, the way you guys do this and this and this, the way you do this and this in your church, you guys got to knock this off and cut this and do this. I mean, he was very much, but a lot of what he's saying in his letters is responsive. He's responding to things, and he's not that systematic. He is not a systematizer. And that's where I think Protestants, and it was part of my own conversion story, was, from an intellectual standpoint, was I spent so many years or decades immersed in that. And it began to dawn on me more and more and more that what I was taught and what my colleagues were doing was using Paul's letters, especially like Romans, as a systematic theology. And it began to dawn on me that it really isn't a systematic theology. And that opened that opened doors in my mind to go other places. And, here I am as a Catholic, because you can't impose on Paul's letters. Paul's letters are not a catechism, but we need a catechism. So where do you go? And if all you have is Paul's letters, then you're like all over the board. And it was the job, I think, of the church to take all of this and gather it and systematize it, which is what the magisterial apostolic teaching of the church does for us.
Yeah.
And when I even talk to my Protestant pastor friends, like I have one Protestant pastor that I've been trying to, convert, to get them to, follow me into Catholicism. I don't know if it's ever, it's a hard sell, but I keep arguing with this pastor, and I keep telling him, come to Italy with me, come to whatever with me, and we'll go to Rome together. But the thing is they keep defaulting back to, but it says in Romans, and it says this, and it says this. And I'm like, right. I've been there. I was in seminary with you. I remember all of that. But guess what? I found over here, here's all of this stuff organized in a way that we never had it organized for us. And that's what the church has done for us over 2,000 years, is to gather all of this and, in a sense, systematize it so that we can say, well, what should we believe about liturgy? What should we believe about the sacraments? What should we believe about, right? All these things. This is how the sacraments are laid out for us. This is what they mean. This is how, instead of just, hey, over in Galatians, Paul tosses this offhand comment, or he responds to somebody in 2 Thessalonians this way. Back to the point we were talking about earlier about women talking in church or the head coverings or whatever, you go, well, yeah, I mean, you get this tennis match of bouncing all this stuff back and forth. But now what I do is I go to the catechism and I say, well, what does it say about the role of women in the church? And that has been now, you've taken all those inputs for thousands of years and through, the apostolic authority of the church under Peter, have organized that into something that is I'd say rational. One other quick thing I would say before we run out of time about those churches that Paul was speaking to, and Marianne, something you said about the women in those churches hosting them in their homes.
Mm-hmm.
This was an eye-opening thing for me over, probably about the last 10 years, and some reading that I did and study that I did is on the concept of the house church in Roman society. And I realized about 10 years ago, over the last 10 years, because of some books I read and things I saw and heard, that I think I had a wrong understanding of what those churches were like and what the word house church meant. So the way it's normally described, house church, I mean, you think, well, okay, it's like a bunch of people meet in a house, right? I mean, and we look at that through our grid, our interpretive grid of what our house is. Like, we're all going to go over to the Hensleys and have church. And, Marianne is going to, make snacks, and we're going to have a Bible study, and, and then we're going to do this, and that's the church. And we meet there every week. And I actually started in my ministry career, I started 3 churches, all of them from my home. When Linda and I got a seminary, I was hired to start a house church in Santa Barbara, California. And so we moved there, and there were no people, and we had no contacts. And we were just missionaries. And so we were there, and I used to go to the gym every day and shoot baskets, and I'd go hang out at the coffee, Starbucks or whatever. And I would just meet people and say, hey, you want to come to our house for dinner? And, and then we started, there were 3 or 4 or 5 people, and I started a Bible study, and then it was like 6 or 8 people, and it was 10 or 12 or 15. And eventually it got big enough, and we started renting a school gym, right? So part of that is we think of these churches, when we think of a house church, I think through sometimes our understanding of what a house is, okay? One of the things when we think about house churches, though, in that Roman context, is that a lot of people had really big houses, okay? So if you were I know some of you, we've been to those parts of the world, we've been to Rome. You go and you see these Roman villas, they have that courtyard and all of these things, that when you looked at certain kinds of people, maybe they were a merchant, or they were a official of some sort, and what happened a lot of times is they were in Roman society, they were sort of the funder, protector, patron of that church, and they made available their villa. And a lot of times it doesn't mean that there were 6 people sitting in a living room on a couch. There could have been 60 or 200. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't a Eucharist and a liturgy, because these had a Roman house was a villa, had a large central courtyard with a sort of a cloister around it. And a lot of times when you go back, and part of my thing was when I began to take some trips to Europe and I began to go to Roman ruins and began to be open to some things I was reading, so I realized that some of these early churches, there may have been 6 or 8 people at first, but there might have been 50, 60, 70, 100, 200. And there was a Roman patron, somebody who had money or status or a house, who allowed the church, who basically gave, made available their facility. So I only say that because as somebody who planted churches out of my living room, not all of these house churches in Thessalonica and Philippia and Ephesus were in somebody's living room. A lot of times they were more formal and established and looked more Catholic than we would think.
I think very initially, though, early on in Acts, that's exactly what we had. And then as it grew, obviously, patrons did support that. You look at the mention of Priscilla and Aquila, and they worked together and hosted the liturgies and helped work through the questions of the day and that kind of thing. That's my point in all of that.
It's totally legitimate, fair point. I completely agree with you. My only point is that the Protestant idea that there was no sort of formal, what we look at in terms of Catholicism as formal liturgy, formal sacraments, these kinds of things, that just because it was being in the house didn't mean that it didn't very early on take what we would call a more formal liturgical form. Because part of the argument for Protestants is the early church was all these house churches, people just sitting around reading the Bible, saying prayers, and then the Catholic Church came along hundreds of years later and added all this stuff on top of it. And I think there's more evidence that within the first couple of decades, it was much more structured than we would, than those sort of Protestant forms would thing. So yeah, kind of that thought. Hey, what other thoughts or questions do you have before we wrap tonight on Paul's missionary journeys, letters? Do you have one thing I wanted to ask you guys is, I've been doing these Lane virtual pilgrimages, and I've been getting emails from people saying there's other places they'd like to see or go. And one of the things that I've been thinking about doing, wouldn't be maybe till fall or whatever, but actually to do a series on the missionary journeys of Paul, where we go to these places. So I was thinking about doing maybe, a 2 or 3 part it would be like a webinar type thing where we could use these tools and say, hey, let's follow Paul's first missionary journey and go to these places in these cities.
Mhm.
We're trying to take people in December to Turkey. Who knows whether that's going to work out or not. But these are fascinating things just to do things we're talking about, to understand this was Galatia, this was Corinth, this was Athens. Does that sound interesting to you guys?